greater than that that's been sort of afforded to the livestock community. So the idea of the LD4D was to let's try and sort of get together a sort of core, a community of practice around the concerns of livestock data for development, and let's try and give them some resources so they could work together and tackle these big problems. I mean, we have, I would say in many cases, analytics are way ahead of the data on the livestock side, but we'd like to push both of them further forward. We need both of those things to go together. So that was really what we tried to do in the design of the LD4D. So yeah, the data and accessibility were a few of those things, but what we recognized that we need to go sort of more than that. It's not just creating more data and creating more models, but increasingly this notion of, and you will have seen it, those of you from the CG system, the notion of FAIR, the global access and open data policy, to be able not only to generate these tools and data, but increasingly to make them interoperable and to make them accessible to more people, not only in the utilization, but I think we would like to have ambitions around, if you like, the democratization of participation in the generation of data and the generation of tools as well. And so that led to obviously the LD4D, and it's been fantastic to see the energy, enthusiasm, and the sort of, just I caught a bit of sort of the introduction from Fiona and the amount of sort of activities that you've been generating and prioritizing and getting done. I mean, it's really sort of very encouraging. What is also encouraging to me, and I speak now as a little bit as I'm a member of, I think Steve Kemp is maybe part of the steering committee of the big data platform for the CGIAR. What is really great is this development that Fiona reported, that the LD4D has become the community of practice around livestock within the CGIAR, with that big data platform, although it's a CGIAR platform, has not only ambitions, but is already realizing that it
Yeah, you got the flavor anyway, and it was good to see his face. So Stan has been a strong advocate for this platform. He kind of almost really, this was his idea in the first place, but way back in January 2017 in Rome. So he has this community is important for him. So it was good to see Stan. We're going to move on to the impact session now, and I'm going to invite Maggie Gill to come up and share that session. And I think you're going to make the first presentation, Maggie, as well. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks very much. And just to say, I'm very privileged to be here. It's about 20 years since I was an active livestock researcher. So to be invited back into the community is is great. Now I'm a sort of semi-retired everything, having gone into management and funding and all sorts of things. So it's great to be here. And I was asked to introduce this, which actually breaks one of my key principles, which is never to chair and give a talk, because I always think there's a risk of abusing the privilege of not sticking to time. So I have my watch directly in front of me, so hopefully I'll stick to the 7 minutes that I've been allotted, just to introduce the concept of impact. Now, one of the key things about impact is that as we hear, there's something like 40 to 50 people between here and online. And to me, that means there are many different definitions of impact. So one of the key things I want to say is when you use that word impact, don't assume that everyone else in the room is thinking exactly the same as you as to what impact is. And I found this very useful. If I can find where the, oops, maybe it doesn't have a pointer. But this website came up with this particular, there's a pointer on this? Oh no, just use it from that, okay. So from that website, this particular project had, snazzy pointer here, split impacts into specific impacts, intermediate impacts, and global impacts. And I think that's an important point to make. And so I want to just take a couple of examples. Maybe this doesn't. Okay, use that one. And I'm actually on the board of GovMed, so I want to use the example of increased vaccines here as an example of an impact pathway, following through on that logic, that the output of an increased vaccine then comes to, in an impact pathway, will lead to an outcome of healthier animals, and hopefully then to increased incomes, to improved livelihoods, and then to a contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the overarching umbrella now under which we all work. So thinking about that as one example there. I first developed this slide when I was in Brisbane and working with Mario and his team, and wanted to have a couple of examples of impact pathways to make the point that we all think about outputs and outcomes. All these different terms can be at different stages in different types of impact for different projects and different impact pathways. So you can see here that if the output of a research project is thinking of something like spatial maps, then the outcome from that is that those maps can be used by others to understand the context, and moving through there, that a global impact then from a pathway like that can be better value for money research, and that can be more targeted research coming out of that as a specific impact can be to speed up the process from outputs to outcomes. And that's one of the great things for me about LD4D, so livestock data for decisions, is basically that we are a community where together we are helping each other add value to specific impact pathways for different parts of this community. And that's one example of it. And what I want to go on and say is one of the important points to understand is that different donors may actually be looking at different impacts. So different people in the room, different donors, funders, investors, however they like to be called, may actually be talking about impact and wanting to measure impact with using different indicators, may have an interest in different parts along that pathway. And often this is put forward as a problem. For me, it's an opportunity. Because if we're actually going to get from something like increased vaccines and eventually to contributions to sustainable development goals, we need a range of funders, investors, whatever. And we need a range of different types of research projects. And LD4D is an important part of something like that, of trying to get the community as adding up to something different, something greater than in individual projects. So again, just another example. Oops, sorry, going the wrong way with that. And then different pathways, seeing how different donors might have different interests there. So just finally, and one other point to bring into play here is that we're talking about research. We're thinking about these different spheres, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the IDRC concept of the different spheres. So researchers have control over the outputs, but they don't necessarily have control moving on then from to the other parts along that pathway. So here, looking at, in order to move from the sphere of control to the sphere of influence, other actors, other players, other users have to be part of that overall community. And moving through to a sphere of interest then, that in terms of the contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals, from my perspective, researchers don't have a lot of control over the contribution of their research to that, but through the sphere of influence, they have to move beyond simply the sphere of control. They have to look at the sphere of influence and understand that overall context within which outcomes and specific impacts are going to be delivered in order to design the research, to design those vaccines, to choose those vaccines which are likely to have more impact along here. So I just want to make those points as we move through this session, that first of all, different people, just be sure if you're having conversations about impact, that you understand what the person you're talking to understands by impact as well. And also to think about research, really focus on what research has control over, all within that overall umbrella of Sustainable Development Goals. And I think I managed to stick within my 7 minutes in terms of that. So moving on swiftly then, we now have in the next 3 7-minute presentations, one from Hannah from the Gates Foundation, one from Tim from DFID. Oh, sorry. First of all, we have Andrew Bisson from USAID, who is also online. So hopefully, in this, that the technology works. And Andrew, I hope that you're there. And if you are, then please start your presentation now.
Hello, Maggie. Xin chào Hanoi. I just wanted to check, can you all hear me? No. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can anyone hear me? Ah, brilliant. You can hear me now. Thank you, Vanessa. You're doing a wonderful job. Okay, so assuming that you can keep hearing me, and Vanessa, please send me a message if it goes out. So firstly, just to say I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there. I spent a lot of very pleasurable years in Vietnam, and there are many of my good friends and colleagues there in the audience. So sincere apologies not to be there. Rather like Stan, I feel I'm being kept away from outsiders, but I'm very excited to be here as a virtual participant. For those who don't know me, I'm a livestock advisor with the Bureau of Food Security at USAID, which includes the Feed the Future program portfolio. Our focus at USAID is very squarely on the lesser developed countries and poor livestock keepers, which Andy referenced in his opening remarks. At USAID, we very much recognize the number of livestock data challenges and the real difficulties in being able to tell what should be a very sort of palatable and good story. So we're very supportive of this initiative to try to improve data systems and to be able to inform decision making using evidence and to be able to tell the livestock story in a much better way. Our task as presenters in this short session is to answer 4 questions. So I will dive straight in there. And Maggie, your early opening comments are well founded on me, because when I first saw it and saw the first question is, what is impact? I also said, what is impact? So I wanted to unpack that a little bit. and break that down into two subcategories. First of all, impact on what? So at USAID, we see the livestock sector and the use of data to strengthen it as a means to an end, and that must lead to important development outcomes, which are our core objectives. And for us specifically, they are improved nutritional outcomes, particularly in our context, the contribution that animal source foods make to those nutritional outcomes. Increased resiliency, which is a growing focus of USAID's work generally, and also the third outcome, sustainable economic growth. So the impact on what must address those three outcomes through livestock. The other area on that to break that down will be to look at the impact for whom. Our focus is very much on the smallholder livestock keepers and smallholder agriculturalists in general, on vulnerable livestock keepers, in particular pastoralists and agropastoralists, and also increasingly a growing emphasis on the consumers of animal source food, that it's safe and that those consumers are well nourished. The second question which we were asked to answer is, why is impact important to USAID? So beyond the sort of obvious answer at improving lives and livelihoods, I think it's important that if we can measure impact, then we can learn. And we can learn effectively what works and what doesn't. And armed with that information, we can allocate our resources, and particularly those of our partners and host governments and the private sector, those resources can be more targeted and more effective and efficient. And through that, essentially create a virtuous cycle of improvement, a learning system of sorts. The next question that we were asked to answer is, what should we measure? And there are many people in the audience far better placed than me to answer that, and my mind ran to 1,000,001 possible metrics. But then I just stopped myself a little bit, and I just wanted to flip that question a bit and rephrase it perhaps. What do our partners want to measure, and for what purpose? Why do they want to measure that? And then how can we help them to do that? And I think this is driving at being a more demand-driven, or as demand-driven as we can be. That the more relevant the data systems that we seek to shape will become, that the greater uptake there will be. So I think initially we might think about starting by measuring the demand for data. And I'm excited to see that there's a session on that a little bit later today. Unfortunately, I'm less excited about staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning to tune into that, so I may have to see the PowerPoint later. My other suggested measures are really maybe looking at data systems metrics. So I think we could be well served by measuring the capacity and connectivity of livestock data systems and the components of them. I'd like to see us measure the uptake and application of the data by the stakeholders who we're trying to serve, the degree to which their needs are met, and again, pushing in on this being demand-driven. And then finally, I'd like to see us measure the level of financial investment in livestock data systems, particularly the proportion of the allocation of domestic resources, and that should grow over time as external donor funding would taper down. I would like to just make a comment about disaggregation. I think that we can glean a little bit more from some of our data if we use some smart disaggregation. At USAID, we're trying to disaggregate for the first time our livestock metrics by production system, so that we can actually separate out agripastoral progress from a commercial broiler in a peri-urban context. I think for us it's important to be disaggregating by wealth group, and where appropriate also by gender. So the final question we were asked to try to address is, what does success look like? And for us, I think a livestock data system which has the capacity and the resources to support demand-driven decision-making by a range of stakeholders, policymakers, industry and producers, and probably many more than that. we'd like to see a data system which has the capacity to learn and adapt. We know our livestock sector is changing rapidly. We know that technologies are increasingly available to help us to learn and to collect and gather data. So some form of adaptive management to a system and the capacity to execute that seems to be important to make sure that systems can sustain themselves. And on that note, a final thought will be that livestock data systems need to be financially sustainable and not entirely dependent on donor resources. Our administrator continually references this phrase, the journey to self-reliance, whereby countries would be self-supporting and able to organize livestock data systems themselves, and we would gradually back off providing development assistance. So we have to design with the end in sight, and that's some form of exit strategy. Those resources, those domestic resources, could also come from the private sector as well as from public offers. And with that, and hope I've touched on those 4 questions, Maggie, I'll hand back to you.
To time and giving very clear direction, and for me 2 things stood out. One, about the efficiency, the need for efficiency, to really think about what we need to measure and how to measure it efficiently, and then secondly, the progress from everything being funded by development assistance through to the involvement of national governments in this. And that was something that came out actually a few times in the introductory session that we had just before coffee, where people were also bringing that up. Okay, so thanks for that. Now we move on to the Gates Foundation, and Hannah is going to come up and give a 7-minute presentation on understanding impact within the Ag Development Programme from the Gates point of view. So over to Hannah.
Thanks, Maggie. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Hannah Reed. I'm a program officer on the policy and data team within the agricultural developments. We refer to it as AgDev. Standing in for Stan, unfortunately he isn't able to join us, but he and I both serve on our monitoring and evaluation working group within the foundation, and so going to just spend a little bit of time within these 7 minutes just giving a quick overview of how we think about impact within the agricultural development program. So I haven't organized this according to those 4 questions as Andrew did, but hopefully we can address them as we go through. So thinking about organizing for impact, we have organized ourselves, we think about it, impact along 3 different levels really. So we have our overarching strategy for the program. We are organized then into 11 portfolio teams, and then each of those portfolio teams is responsible for a set of grants. And the strategy is really the overarching framework, and we use our results framework to really guide our strategy, and I'll show you what that looks like. The portfolios then contribute to the goals within our strategy, and then each portfolio is responsible for managing the grants that help us to achieve those goals. Our results framework has 5 different levels. And you can see that those levels really align with these different different levels of how we're organized. So we have our impact goals, our strategic goals, primary outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and outputs. And this really speaks to what Maggie was saying before, that at the strategy level, this is our indirect influence. And I think you called it the sphere of interest, really. So this is our long-term areas that we are really interested in influencing, but we're not doing that alone, of course. It's with all of you in the room, the partners, countries. We are just really contributing at that level. The direct influence is at this portfolio level, where we have our primary outcomes, which align to the specific goals of each of our different portfolio teams, and then the intermediate outcomes flow there. And really that area of control, or that area of influence, really is at the grant level, and that's how we think about it within the foundation. So moving to the results framework, the results framework is the primary tool that we use to monitor performance, track results, and align portfolio programs. This framework describes our theory of change and the hypothesized impact pathways. So at the very top, this is our impact goal. I know it's a little bit small, but the impact goal for us is inclusive agricultural transformation that increases rural incomes, empowers women, better nourishes families, and spurs economic growth. Below that, we have 4 strategic goals, and these are the 4 areas that the foundation really focuses on to contribute to that overall impact goal. Those are increasing agricultural productivity for smallholders, so this is both for crops and livestock, increasing household incomes, increasing equitable consumption of safe, affordable, and nutritious diets year-round, and increasing women's empowerment in agriculture. So you can see that for those 4 strategic goals, livestock can play a really important role in helping us to contribute to those outcomes that are described. The below in the orange are the 10 primary outcomes that we see as those specific pathways. And for each of our different portfolios, of which livestock is one of them, you could, and with the grants within there, you can follow the pathway to see how we anticipate actually seeing impact through to those strategic and impact level goals. An important, we have those goals, and it's important that we can actually measure and monitor progress. And this is something that we have, important to say that all of this is a work in progress. And Stan has been really instrumental in helping us to define what are these core indicators. How do we know if we're actually making progress in these areas? And so we've defined this set of 12 key indicators. Obviously, there are a lot of other things that you can monitor and measure. And actually, we hope that through this community of practice, you can help us refine that list of what are those best measures? Where are their data available? Are we actually interpreting the results correctly to know whether changes are happening? So these are within our monitoring and evaluation strategy, we have our results framework, we have our core indicators, we have indicators at all of the different levels. Once we have those core indicators identified, we then set targets. So one of our targets is to double income, for example. So you'll see for each of the different countries that we work in, we have specific targets that we've set, and then looking at growth rates to really see what would be required to reach those targets. And this is, again, some work that is absolutely in progress, but it's really important for us to be able to say, we know that context matters. We know that each country is very different. The impact pathways to achieve those goals in each country will look very different. So for us, we're starting to look at, when we're thinking about impact, what are the targets? What would it take to get there? We've been partnering with IFPRI, and I say this has been led by Stan, so hopefully he's on the line, can answer some questions. But looking at what happens if we're successful, and really doing some modeling to project the potential impact within each of our target geographies. And so, for example, if you look on the right, is one of our goals is around doubling productivity. And so being able to look at what are those projected sources of growth within the economy, what would happen if there was just a business as usual, and what would happen with what is the additional growth that would come from investments such as through the foundation's portfolio areas and investments. So this is something that we are developing, starting to look at for each of those 12 indicators that you saw at that impact level, strategic goal and above. Essentially, what would it take to reach those targets? What does it look like to be successful? What are the different contributors to growth? And that's where data is really critical. We're using the best available data that we have. I think the live gaps work is a good example of looking at this from the livestock side. So exactly the same. What would it take to reach those productivity targets? What are the key levers? We then map those levers or potential intervention areas into our portfolios, and that's how we then invest against those potential areas of impact. So we can project impact, but it's also important to measure impact. And the primary way that we do that is really through impact evaluations. And I'm not going to say too much about this, but I think a session on impact wouldn't be complete without talking about impact evaluations. Really, counterfactuals are critical. So for us, we measure impact and conduct impact evaluations at the grant level. And it's important for us, we identify specific investments ahead of time, right? Because we have to be able to set that counterfactual and the baselines. So specific potential high impact grants are identified for impact evaluations early on. We take an outcome-based investing approach, which means that for each investment, we really set up a results framework. It's all around what are the investments are set up around the potential outcomes that we'll achieve. So that's another way that we embed the evaluations into that results framework. And we also have a pretty big body of work that's really investing in impact research. And there's an investment with JPAL and SIGA, which is the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative, which is really focused on RCTs and how do we generate evidence around potential impact. Just to wrap up, these are some of the key tools that we use, and the results framework was developed in 2016. So still fairly nascent. We've been spending quite a bit of time on defining these indicators, setting targets, setting up a monitoring system, and coming this year, we'll really be refining the learning agenda and setting up our evaluation policy.
Thanks very much, and thanks for, again, a clear presentation of what it is that a funder is looking for, and also for sharing work in progress, because that's part of what this is about, giving us an opportunity to input. So our next presentation is from DFID, from Tim Leyland, and that will pull together the three inputs from the donors funder side, and then we will move on to look at grantee impact modelling. And just to reassure you that if all our speakers stick more or less to time, there will be a chance for questions and answers at the end. So please note down your questions for specific speakers so that we can pick those up when we get to the question time. Over to Tim.
Thanks, Maggie. First, I'd like to thank Sebi for bringing me over here. DFID's very interested in this topic because primarily we want to know where to invest. So we need to know where we're going to get maximum impact. But what is impact? I'm a little bit. I should explain that I don't work for DFID anymore. I'm a consultant, so I can't speak for them. But I can just convey to you how DFID sees impact. And after the last three presentations, I think I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that they basically use the term results to cover everything, let alone outputs, outcomes, and impact. They just call everything results. And there's documentation which actually defines that as development aims and ends. That's what results are according to DFID. No, wrong button.
Use the down arrow.
There we go. So I think the first point I'd like to make for a government agency, of course, impacts are political and they do change over time. And there's been quite a significant change for DFID over the last 20 years. When the Labour government came in 1997, it was all about contribution and partnerships, direct budgetary support. Therefore, what was impact depended upon what your partner government saw as impact. And therefore, there was a very loose methodology for measuring impact because it was more about the partnerships and transformational activities. And that has changed quite significantly over the last 20, 30 years. The golden years were probably from 2003, 2008, where the very strong emphasis in terms of impact was addressing poverty. And then after the financial crash, 2008, there was a significant change. A new government came in. There was still a commitment to increasing the UK aid budget to 0.7% of GNI. However, we shifted away from that transformational goal to one of results-based management. and very clear milestones which had to be achieved. And we therefore looked for value for money, and increasingly in the last 3-4 years about what can the aid program do for UK interests. So impacts has changed quite considerably. In 2015, we have a single departmental plan, which is essentially the indicators against high-level strategic goals. And this is UK aid strategy. This the equivalent to what Andrew just described for USAID. There's 4 main objectives for the UK at the moment. Under the current government, this could change if the government changes. Strengthening global peace, security and governance. And within that, there are some indicators about the amount of people reached through humanitarian aid, for example. Strengthening resilience, response to crises. Similarly, most of the indicators around humanitarian aid. Interestingly, the UK's research budget falls within that second objective on building resilience. To give you an example, there are about 16 major indicators against these. Most of them are not relevant to the livestock sector. Some are, for example, within promoting global prosperity, number of people supported in terms of raising incomes. You can see the application there for livestock. Another one, capital investment, again, quite relevant to the livestock sector. In terms of tackling extreme poverty, most of the indicators here are around maternal child health and nutrition, but there's one there which is relevant to zoonotic disease. For all of these strategies, there are SDGs identified which match up with them. So, for example, promoting global prosperity, these are the SDGs which DFID see as crucial to achieving that strategic objective. And each of them will have different SDGs. And then finally, the other increasingly important one over the last 5 years has been value for money. And there, DFID has come up with an index for assessing every single project to see whether it is providing value for money. So I think the key point I'd like to make here is that livestock specifically doesn't really register in DFID's overall strategic objectives. So as we analyze livestock data, we have to see basically how it moves into that sphere of influence and interest in order to meet some of the high-level indicators that DFID have. And it seems that this is perhaps the area we should be aiming for. And we already have indicators for the SDGs. There are 244 of them. And how do you make sense of 244 indicators? Actually, there's only, I think, 233. 9 of them are common to different SDGs. But making sense of that and how the livestock data analysis fits into that is quite a challenge. People have started to think about this already. FAO have produced some rather large manuals on this, and I believe OIE and World Bank have also done some thinking around this. But I think that in terms of this meeting and deciding what types of data might be most relevant, then I think we possibly need to go back to the SDGs, looking at those indicators and seeing how they could be utilized, how the data analysis could support achieving those indicators. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks again for keeping to time. And so you see a common pattern emerging out of this. Very much the SDGs as being the overarching framework within which we all work. can see the importance of numbers. We may all have views of our own about how much reliance there is on those numbers and how credible they are, but somehow we have to work through that, and this is an excellent opportunity for doing that, having that discussion, that dialogue. Again, the opportunity that is there to influence the funders in terms of how these things are seen. Enough from me. So now we move from the funders through to